Hey everybody, how are you doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and I should say, Schopenhauer, you doing? Because today we're going to talk about one of the central German thinkers amongst our Germanic thinkers. We have just gone from Kant to Hegel, who are two of the early heavy hitters, along with Leibniz, but Kant and Hegel are more central, and Leibniz is a little strange with the monads. But now we are going to move to, yippee skippy, German pessimism, everybody's favorite sort of thing. Again, to paraphrase the Monty Python joke, if you are thinking of a theme for your next social gathering or party, German pessimism is a terrible idea. It's just going to bum everybody out. But we're going to talk about German pessimism, how it isn't pessimistic about everything. It likes the will, doesn't like reason so much. Reason's kind of questionable. Looking at it funny now. We're going to talk about German pessimism, which is very much the turn from reason is a good thing with Kant and Hegel. Hegel is not a romantic. We just got through a couple bits of Hegel there. Schopenhauer does not like Hegel, as I will talk about. Hates the guy. Teaches at the same place against him, or did, briefly. Does not like the guy. Thinks that Hegel is nuts, and he thinks that Hegel is nuts for saying this world is rational. Why? Well, Schopenhauer very much believes the world is alive, but does not believe the world is rational, nor Newtonian, in interesting Kantian ways. Schopenhauer very much considers himself both a Kantian and a Buddhist from India. The Buddha. Schopenhauer doesn't think he's from India, but he does think the Buddha was, and calls himself in later life a Buddhist. The first. Hume may or may not have gotten Indian ideas, as I mentioned. And Gopnik points that out in a paper. With Schopenhauer, he calls himself a Buddhist a la the Indian philosopher. He says it is really passions that deep down are what Kant's talking about. Here, oddly, in fact, we have another reversal I'll talk about in a bit. What Kant is talking about, of course, is very much categorical reason in the shape of 2 + 3 = 5. Schopenhauer says actually everything is all will, and then representation, flips Kant kind of upside down and goes very romantic and passionate. And if you are interested in art and interested in philosophy and interested in the splitting of analytic from continental thought, Hegel is very much a watershed, as I mentioned. Analytic Anglophonic thought very much likes Kant and Neo-Kantianism, doesn't like Hegel so much. But actually, while Hegel includes the back and forth motions of history, which are quite passionate when enacted, it's with Schopenhauer and then Nietzsche that you turn towards something more like German thought gets more romantic, gets more passionate, gets more into how the structure of things is not so much reason as much as it is underlying will and emotion and passion and romance. That's what truly rules the world and life. And then you have Darwin, and after Schopenhauer, you have Darwin and Nietzsche. Darwin's a Brit, of course, but you have Nietzsche in a more Darwinian world saying, what are Hegel and Kant talking about? The world is not a rational waltz step. It's a back and forth clashing of passions, which is the French Revolution. And how French is Hegel, of course. Nietzsche's a guy who doesn't like, he's like, we Germans, we eat a lot of pretzels and beer. We're kind of terrible people. But the French, and he knows how much that offends people in his time and is freaking out the squares, man. The French, they really know how to feel, people out and such. And so I think we Germans don't know how to feel, but if we did, we'd be more like Schopenhauer and the Buddha here, although Nietzsche thinks the Buddha is too, in a sense, nihilistic and not passionate, jumping up and painting a Pollock enough. But we'll get to all of that, and this is actually, I find, definitely, I love a lot of the stuff up to Hegel, very much. I find myself passionate about giving the lectures. As I start in on Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, I can very much include in continental thought a lot more of the deep, somewhat psychological, and we could say very much here, Freudian. Although I am very post-Freud, I'm not into psychoanalysis. My grandfather, as I often mention, was a psychoanalyst who went more towards Gestalt stuff, and he was a interesting and difficult human being. So in my own thinking, I hope not to be so difficult a person, but I am so much so a Gestalt and Wittgenstein guy, which means I like Nietzsche, I like Wittgenstein, I like open, simple interpretation that is passionate. And so I like Freud plenty, but I also like post-Freud Gestalt. How do we feel about that? As your therapist continues to ask you. And then draw weird things on a notepad, perhaps. Again, why does Rorschach keep painting my parents fighting? So, with all of that, before Freud, you have Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, who's going to come next. Actually, Kierkegaard, I'm sticking him into the works, because he kind of comes a bit pre-Nietzsche, but he's a bit off the map. As we'll talk about, that Schopenhauer to Nietzsche is the time when things get somewhat, it is the dark passions that truly guide the reason, which is a bit of Hume. Remember, reason is the slave and fruit of the passions, but it gets more, very ficta in my pinata story. It gets that much more like people look at humanity in a post-Darwinian age, when we increasingly have industrialization leading people to something like cynical postmodernism, where people are no longer even necessarily thinking the machine is simply evil, but yeah, the machine is evil, but it's also the good, and what are we going to do about it? We're not really sure, which is very much the move from French existentialism through structuralism, post-structuralism to postmodernism. Now, all of that stuff you can study on your own, but as I like to tell people, and as I have, a lot of times people study a bit of Foucault or a bit of French thought, which is recent, it's hip, it's cool, they can't understand it. Get the basics of the German ideas down. It's nice to have some Greek and some Indian stuff. I love all that, and Chinese stuff. Technically, you can kind of start studying modern Europe kind of independently. I wouldn't without Islam and plenty of other stuff, but you can kind of cut Europe off and say, okay, it's sort of a new school, as you can study Islamic philosophy independently and Indian philosophy independently. You can study modern European thought as a new kind of break. But if you want to study French thought, you really probably should study German thought up to Heidegger, from perhaps Leibniz, but Kant to Heidegger is pretty important as far as German thought being important for then post-war thought in France, art, and life today. If we do live in postmodern times, whether or not we do, it's very kind of French and fancy, as a lot of English words are, and still. And at the same time, a lot of fancy art and fashion and stuff. And if that is the fancy stuff still, and if French people have been coming out here to California for a while, trying to seek out even the later, hipper French stuff, although there is new weird cinema that I don't entirely like none, I gotta tell you. I like the older men in the trench coats smoking cigarettes, wondering what a life means, rather than revealing too much. But with all of that, and French extremities and otherwise, we're not getting to France just yet, because we're going to start here with Schopenhauer, and that is very much German romantic pessimism. Yippee-skippy. Schopenhauer onward to Nietzsche, Heidegger, and a bunch of cynical French people, which influences all of the art and culture you see around you like heck, not alone, or with my mangled English words, alone, but as a major influence in beatnik and hippie culture. I happen to hope that I could be an amateur expert here at doing philosophy and beatnik and hippie culture, and telling you influences on surrealism, on beatniks, on hippies, come a bit from Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Bataille, and we're going to get to all of them. If you like the world of art and weirdness, and again, as I unfortunately will keep reminding people at some point, it's like, yeah, sex and sex violence is kind of the worst things that occur, and I'm not going to mention specifics of all that, but knowing all of that, it's sort of like the Freudian, well, the sex and the violence kind of rules the day more than the rational categories kind of thought, which is very Freudian, very modern, very post-Darwinian, very post-Freudian. And so, if you're interested in beatnik art, hippie art, science fiction, making philosophy relevant to everyday life, hitting Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the German pessimists before getting into the French thinkers is pretty hip, cool, and history and culture all around us. I happen to think it's like Americans have been influenced by this. If you're hipper and more intellectual, and I've talked to a lot of weird and interesting people, you pick up pieces of this. I had to find out about Bataille from a friend when I was in grad school. I was like, who the heck is that? There's a lot of different pieces here that I've worked over the years, and I am presenting you with the simplest frame of the ideas of each of these thinkers. So I pause here at the gate here of German pessimism before I explain what German pessimism is, and then who Schopenhauer is and why. We're going to get into here eventually, as we talk through the rest of the Germans and the French, how modern philosophy in the continent, which is Germany and then France, not so much the Anglophonics, somewhat, thought on the continent pre-World War II Germany, and a bit, up to World War I, World War II. Then post-war, post-World War I and World War II, meaning post-war, post-World War II, French thought becomes very Heideggerian, very Hegelian and Nietzschean, very German, but also then very French, modern French thought. We actually have only had the first guy in modern European philosophy is a Frenchman, is Descartes. And there are other important minor figures of all sorts of different nations and states and other things going on that we are passing over without mentioning in the details. And yet, we really haven't had any French people so far. There are political French thinkers, others Rousseau. But what we actually have here is that the next major French folks are going to be coming along, as far as ontology, kind of subjective, objective truth, are very much going to be those. I was joking with Hegel and the Ted Cruz and the stuff at the end of the last talk on Hegel. We're going to be going towards French Romantic territory, and then we're going to be coming into postmodern times, surrealism. I love watching surreal movies and decoding them, and I will be working on videos about that because that's very Existentialism 101 and a bunch of other stuff, and really cool, hip public art that we should appreciate and talk about. All of us, me, you, everyone. But these are some of the core ideas I do love because I love psychology, I love human emotion, I love art. And so if you like philosophy, and especially if, like Hume, you want philosophy to be passionate, involved with art, life, and useful to your mind, such that you can use it to interpret situations in your life and situations of art, which I'm getting increasingly into with Poe and Lewis Carroll. You should probably know Schopenhauer, the very basics of Nietzsche, the very basics of Bataille, the very basics of Heidegger, and then with the Bataille, the one French guy, you should then from there know post-war French thought. And I am going to, in these talks, be giving you the basics of all of that. And again, you could study any of these individuals for years. So, in the early 1800s, let's get on from that introduction here to German pessimism. What the heck is it, and why do we care? I don't want to. In the early 1800s, the time of Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, Germany and German thought went through a period, and I am including, again, Spinoza and Kierkegaard kind of with the Germanics. I know that's kind of stupid culturally, but in loose, overlapping things, it is easy to lump Spinoza. And then at the beginning, although, again, he's elsewhere and Kierkegaard elsewhere, it's nice and easy with the Germanic languages and places and stuff to lump these into kind of loosely and stupidly the German thought stuff, which is how I tend to put this together. My apologies, but again, loose language families. So in the early 1800s, Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard and others who are seminal first pessimistic, romantic, post-Hegelian, anti-Hegelian thinkers, both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, this and the next talk will be anti-Hegelian thinkers. These are guys who don't like Hegel, say they don't. Like this jerk, Kierkegaard a little bit nicely and tongue-in-cheek. Schopenhauer openly says, guys living in a madhouse. So we just had Hegel. Guess what's dialectically an opposite Hegel coming? Hegel's like final form of Lutheranism. These guys kick off opposite. Schopenhauer's Buddhism. Kierkegaard's like, no, existential Christianity. You're German Lutheranism. That's cute. And he had his problems with the Kierkegaard and the churchyard and the church. And we'll talk about all of that. But we'll get to that next time with Kierkegaard. Germany went from a period in the 1800s of an optimism about science, Enlightenment, Deism, Reformation, Lutheranism, to a period of pessimism with revolution and overturning of things. Now, funny enough, Kant breaks his routine for the French Revolution, is very much a rationalist and a deist. So he is kind of revolutionizing what he thinks is true Christian thought and thinks it is more science and math and morality. Hegel comes along and he adds in the Newtonian pendulums of history such that everything moves around and the French Revolution is very much a model working its way to the careful and nice stability and quite conservative Napoleon who brings all into a nice stable empire. Now, by this time, and as I like to mention, human thought all over the place, Egypt, Greece, China, goes through flourishing periods of tragedy and when people are forced to ask questions during warring states periods, and then a lot of times things are codified with new empires into new systems of thought, art, philosophy, religion, science. Lots of movements work in the vacuum of empire with new thinking where they can and have to. Be like, what are the new old answers? A lot of times these are framed as the older answers, but they are actually newer answers. All of them. And then later, like the Luther way I was framing with Hegel, then later it is framed as this new revolutionary thing once it's the safe conservative base, and then once you have that, now it's this thing. We can see a lot of that, of course, in American politics, and I do frame it that way. Although I'm trying to refrain from being directly political here. So in the late 1700s, the Americans and the French, of course, had revolutions. And I believe the 1770s and the 90s, I believe, along with the developments in England. England also has their civil war and back and forth. And it had brought new rights to the common people, although it ended up a bit more even conservative with the monarchy in England. The French removed the monarchy and removed, well, the head of the state from the head, etc. Yes, a couple of times. The Americans and the French kind of threw off radically things and then reformed, and you can read most cynical history saying, and they kind of reformed back very much the way they were before, and we're like, we like this fine. So it is kind of cynical with all that, but it is also revolutionary steps that are amazing. The same time, Germany was a loose confederacy of regional principalities, ruled by local princes. When the German people rose up to fight for rights similar to their neighbors, the French directly, and then across the pond, the Americans, more so further, several of the powerful princes of the regions of Germany, I imagine the Rhineland, although again I'd have to see the map on that, they came together to crush the popular people's peasant uprisings, very much like the Han princes actually in the end of China came together to crush the Taoist Yellow Turban rebellions, and then kind of fell apart after that and didn't really keep the Han together for, I don't mean to laugh, I'm sure that was massive casualties, all of these things, as I giggle nervously. That yes, as with all of these things, there were back and forth motions in history that somewhat resemble each other in massive human forms of life. Hegel's followers, Marx and Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto and invented the communisms for this discouraged German audience. So, you've heard of, I often like to joke at the very beginning, of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the German Revolution, and watch the students' faces kind of go, and I can't really do that with you on this video. That basically Marx and Engels are writing, and Marx and Engels are working on that, I think in the British Museum and the British Library and stuff, over with the Brits, is that they're, which is not the most communist of places still, so that they do have health care, oddly. So that Marx and Engels are basically writing the Communist Manifesto for Germans who failed to have the German Revolution. They're like, you want a revolution, guys? What if we're talking about a super French Revolution that removes the capitalists from society? And again, Americans have heard of that before, even if they hate it. So, plenty. So yeah, this is basically, there wasn't a German Revolution. It was oddly like the end of Han China. And the Germans, meanwhile, this is also oddly like the Medicis ruling over a very prosperous and intellectual Renaissance, which was not the French word Renaissance at the time, but only 200 years later, that you actually have a proliferation of German thought. All this amazing German thought I'm teaching you all happened in a place that was less revolutionary and democratic in their own eyes in ways than with human beings being human beings all over the place, and in North Korea and everywhere, I'm sure. They weren't as, democratically revolutionary as France, and they got upset about it, tried to revolt, and that was all put down. So then the Communist Manifesto is like, hey, who wants a super French revolution for everybody? And yeah, that would make a whole lot of sense at the time. Plenty, of course, to those folks, which would be why it was written for that audience in that time. That people will rise up like the French, overcome oppression with a revolution that will remove the top and the nobles and such, and the German princes that those German peasants hate so dang much. German pessimism was found in French popular culture and bawdy songs and rhymes, and also found in high culture. And of course, we're going to cover only the bawdy rhymes, none of the high-ended philosophy. So German philosophy, likewise, turned from the reason of Leibniz and Kant and Hegel, who is no romantic. He wants the spirit to move through us dialectically in the pendulums. But he actually very much, Hegel does say to Schleiermacher, Veilmaker, one of the main Protestant theologians and actually a rival of Hegel. Hegel fought back and forth with him. Schleiermacher says that the true Christian should throw open their heart upward, to God, And Hegel says throwing open your mind to being itself and just being a mystic entirely. Hegel says if that were true, then a dog would be the best Christian, is what Hegel says. Because what Hegel means by that, in context, God wants us to be the Mutazilites of Islam. He doesn't really know about. He also wants us to be Newton, effectively, is what Hegel means. He wants us to be Newton and Napoleon. God wants, Europeans, Germans, and the French, sometimes at least as Napoleon, to basically be the manifestation of the reason. God does not want everybody to be hippies and Taoists and wander around with open hearts and minds, for Hegel. He is not the romantic, versus Schopenhauer, who's oddly a Kantian, and he fits that together weird and upside down. But Nietzsche and other thinkers are going to go much more. Kind of like Locke was somewhat empirical, but still rationalist, much like Descartes trying to separate objective from subjective. And then later Hume is going far more skeptical. Schopenhauer is still a Kantian, and then Nietzsche's like, we can go full romantic, kind of Darwinian on this. What sort of triangular reason are Kant or Hegel talking about? Come on, that's the shape of the passions, a la Hume, whom Nietzsche likes plenty fine. So you have, of course, the British empiricism again informing different strands opposing of the German thought, both the rationalist-ish kind of idealism, and then the more empirical, kind of more Hume-style skeptical empiricism with the more romantic German pessimists. All of these categories overlap. Again, some of the rationalists are Kant's a rationalist and an idealist. Similarly, Schopenhauer actually can count as a German idealist because he's a Kantian, but he is also a pessimist. I would not call Kant a pessimist. He's pretty close-lipped and dour about many things Kant would be, other than grandfather clocks. I imagine he likes them, even though he tends to walk past them without showing them any emotion, or mouth movements. But aside from that, other than, I guess, a fixed grimace, which Wittgenstein would say is not a true open smile, But aside from my art and jokes, essentially, with all of this stuff, German thought is turning from the idealism and the rigid towards a more loose and open-ended pessimistic romanticism, which that sort of thinking is much more surreal, is much more what people identify with continental philosophy, German and French thought, after the heavy hitters and the German idealists of Kant and Hegel. In fact, the word phenomenology is good to bring back up. Technically, phenomenology is something that starts very much with Hegel and his folks. I've already talked about Fichte and Schelling. But then phenomenology very quickly becomes something much more identified with proto-psychology and something like Freud and something like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But something like post-Heideggerian thought would be something like phenomenology. So phenomenology is psychological, but something like a Freudian, romantic, emotional-centered psychology. Less than a rationalist idealism or a frame of the mind like glasses. So, German pessimism is very much taking dancing, jumping cats and saying reason is actually a drive. It's a will. When we think, thought is primarily, I happen to say I'm very influenced by this stuff and I like this stuff. I do a lot of thinking and work in this kind of way, but it takes all kinds of thinking, of course. Is that will and emotion are very much a part of, if not the structure of thought. So if you're looking for thought to be mathematical or factual, what if thinking is itself driven, here Fichte's Das Ich, through Hegel's back and forth motions of history, to Schopenhauer saying we really always remain human. The history of a village is the history of an empire, says Schopenhauer, which is a playful way of saying nothing changes us. We remain primordially human. That's very hippie. And then you have Nietzsche saying we are human, all too human, which is one of the titles of his work. Life at its best here for the continent and more romantic, pessimistic thinking. And here notice pessimistic is not sad about everything. It's more pessimistic specifically about reason being ideal and true and framing truth statically and mathematically rather than the motions of passion and want and reason. Hume was already about this very much. Life at its best is romantic and dramatic, not rational or mathematical. I often say, somebody mentioned, I don't remember who, I wish I did, analytic thought wants to be science. Continental thought wants to be art. Philosophy. American English-speaking philosophy wants to be science and talks like that and doesn't really. Continental French and German thought wants to really be art. English philosophy valorizes the scientist and the pure research and the mathematician, kind of the physicist says, let's imagine a spherical cow ideally. And we have here definitely the move towards that it is the Germans and the French say, like Hume already said himself in his work, and I talked about, it is the artist who better expresses than the mathematician effectively philosophy and passion and life. Poe, I like now a lot, says you have to be both a mathematician and a poet to be a genius, which would be trying to balance the two out, but Poe is known very much a little bit less for math and a little bit more for, well, as he says, if I want to create a work of genius, I bury a young woman underground. That seems to be a real page-turner. People think that's genius. Why? You know what I mean? Well, because it moves everyone, is what he says. How stupid is this? As he says, Poe says the dumbest, and I really like, we are right around the time of Poe. I am going to give talk about Poe for the logic class. I will work that into, it'll be a talk on here. Very much at the same time, Edgar Allan Poe is saying something much like Schopenhauer, but over in America, and both Schopenhauer and Poe pre-Nietzsche. Really, you have to balance being Kant and mathematical out with being something in motion and emotional. If you don't do both, which has been identified a lot of times in ancient thought and modern thought with presentations of male and female symbolically and female and male interactions. I think that's a lot of surreal movies. I'm going to read way too much into too much later things about all of that. But life has to be sort of masculine and mathematical. It also has to be effeminate and emotional. Listen to these, of course, very broadly, and I'm not trying to police anybody's anything at all. But with all of these sorts of things and the two-sidedness, the Taoists say to be if you want to be a genius as a dude, learn to think and look like a woman at things. I guess look at women, etc. Ha ha, I'm funny. Basically, with all of this stuff, you need a balance in life, but then other thinkers will go even more romantic, like Nietzsche, who goes beyond the balance of math and poetry. For Poe, the balance of Kant and the passions and the will of the world for Schopenhauer, who is a Kantian, but is very pessimistic about reason as a German pessimist. It is really the window dressing of what are truly the passions for Schopenhauer, which is oddly Fichte. I accidentally kicked a cat. Speaking of the lurking passions. Yes. Hey, buddy. He's laying down in the sun. He doesn't need to rise up as were, and I think you saw him in the background over here earlier. If he pause a bit, I'll pause and bring him up. But, speaking of the lurking passions, and again, as Schopenhauer somewhat seems to say, we are each a seething pile of weasels, perhaps shaved down into poodles for Schopenhauer, and thus civilized. Although, again, history teaches us we do not learn from history, learn about it. Kant and Hegel are confident that reason can complete itself as an objective system. Pessimism turns away from reason, completion and objectivity, towards passion, incompleteness, and subjectivity. Notice I did labor on the point that for Hegel and others, objectivity and subjectivity are intersubjectivity together, and that you have the direction of das Ich being a directed sort of thing, and that I mentioned with Fichte, you have das Ich, being the I and the self, not only being a passionate but an element of reason and thought explicitly, but you also have something like the incompleteness and the openness and the closure of things with Fichte and Schelling. So we basically have more of a turn even further towards all of that. Oddly enough, you can see that Schopenhauer is being more Fichte and certainly hating Hegel, which is pre-Freud. German pessimism, centrally Schopenhauer and his follower Nietzsche, but also very applicable to the Danish thinker Kierkegaard, fed into the later existentialism of Sartre and absurdism of Camus. Sartre is the one who coins the term existentialism. He gets existential from Hegel. He then changes it around, and Heidegger uses the term. Sartre is the first one, in spite of the fact that Heidegger uses Hegel's term more so, Sartre is the one who is the first existentialist and calls everybody before him existentialist after the fact, those he likes. Sartre claims Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and also Heidegger, as founding forerunners, though none of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, the more Germanic thinkers, use the term that way as a school. All the thinkers flourish in popularity during recent periods of pessimism, World War I, World War II, the Korean War and of the beatniks and Vietnam War of the hippies. That a lot of this kind of pessimistic thinking has thrived, whether you like it or lump it, as I always say. So, that said, that is the kind of intro to German pessimism. So let's get a bit more pessimistic and optimistic about emotions and will, and then sad and then happy, in the endless Mobius strip of the sad side of the bed with sad, pessimistic grandfather Wolverine, Arthur Schopenhauer, who does, in his latter haircut, look a lot, I have to say, like cranky grandpa Wolverine of the X-Men. He lived from 1788 to 1860. Again, we're walking slowly out to the 1900s here. And he took Kant's philosophy, famously, and radically inverted it. He made reason a manifestation of will. Like Nietzsche, Schopenhauer's father died, and like a lot of philosophers, he had a parent who he lost at a young age. His father died tragically when he was young, and this did leave him free to not only question things, but then pursue philosophy rather than the family profession. For Schopenhauer, it was business. For Nietzsche, after Kierkegaard, it is the ministry that he did not do like 5 generations deep of his family. That would be German Lutheranism, not the final form of Nietzsche's individuality nor human culture. Schopenhauer, more pessimistic about the use of reason than Kant, saw the gulf and gap between the world and our ideas as a stormy abyss that forever frustrates our idealizations. He agreed with Kant that the mind works categorically and mathematically, but the gap between our conceptions and the thing in itself turned Schopenhauer from Kant's rationalism and mathematical science to Buddhism and the ecstasy of art. Much as Marx took Hegel and stood him on his head, turning Hegel's dialectical idealism into dialectical materialism, Schopenhauer stood Kant on his head, in some ways following his own teacher, Fichte. Kant sought objectivity in reason, the most abstract part of the mind, the most idea as opposed to brute understanding of apples, the most removed from immediate sensation. Schopenhauer argued that sensation and the experience of the will is basic. That is very much today Schopenhauer's will of the body is very much embodied will. Like Merleau-Ponty, Schopenhauer argued that the fundamental experience of ourselves is not in the abstractions of reason, but in what is often called the embodied mind today sometimes, which is basically terms that point you towards subjective objectivity, in which how we experience basic objects does inform and change who we are and the ideas of ourselves and all of these things. Think about, say, Freud identifying with gender or not, and gendered behavior a la Judith Butler, and that really who we are is what we do, and that is our innermost selves. A lot of this kind of thinking, starting with Schopenhauer here, through Merleau-Ponty to a lot of postmodern stuff, Judith Butler, etc., would be a lot of this kind of thing. You are what you do most bodily with your hands and your mind all together. Pulling thinking down out of the clouds from German idealism, even further as it was pulled down out of the clouds and into the brain, out of the cosmos from Greek idealism with Plato. We are, for Fichte and for Schopenhauer, at base a striving. What we are, think about the id and then forming the ego for Freud. It is das Ich of Fichte and the ego, very much, and id, and all of that, back and forth these, and not getting into that right now with Freud. So Schopenhauer was critical of other philosophers for focusing on abstractions of reason and ignoring love, friendship, sexuality, and artistic passion, which are central to our existence. Hume and Nietzsche are similar thinkers. I like that too. If you are doing philosophy, should you ignore friendship and sex? Well, but those are important things. Well, let's make it very mathematical. Is that everyday life? No, not at all. Well, then most people aren't rational with everyday life, and the things that are important, are they? That's not very active philosophy for Hume. That's not very pragmatics for American philosophy. For Kant, freedom comes from reason. For Schopenhauer, freedom is only found in the assertion of will. When I'm doing something, I am free. Or actually, when I am sitting back and feeling and just sitting, I suppose, and listening to opera for Schopenhauer, or meditating like a Buddhist, that is actually, in a certain sense, feeling and experiencing the will, hearing the opera or meditating. And that could also be assertion of the will and feeling the will as the opera, as oneself. So it doesn't have to just be getting up and acting. In fact, Nietzsche is going to find Schopenhauer too Buddhistic and too let's listen to opera and not do stuff. Nietzsche's like, go build the craziest Burning Man camp ever out in the middle of nowhere. So Nietzsche is far more the activist, whereas Schopenhauer, Nietzsche finds too much the pacifist in being the pessimist. Nietzsche also doesn't like plenty, but he wants to go out and fight, whereas Schopenhauer seems to want to melt back into the world and into opera and into the will of the world as listening to it Buddhistically. Nietzsche finds all that too nihilistic, which is what's coming after this. Although we're going to have the Kierkegaard, and he's kind of back and forth with that. For Kant, freedom is a moral decision. For Schopenhauer, freedom is found in action, or at least in what you're doing, which Nietzsche finds too passive, ironically enough, in Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer considered the freedom of reason to be an illusion, as the mind is compulsive relative to the body. Thoughts appear free, but the purest part of our freedom is not in the channeling of abstractions, but in the recognition of volition, of will. I am very interested in reading movies for what are the simplest, most obvious things going on here, and in a very Wittgensteinian way, and in doing that kind of interpretation, or trying to use movies to show what good and bad interpretation would be, and very much in the spirit of Poe, what are you looking for when you're looking past the abstractions and the reasoning of people? You're looking for their basic wants and needs and how they're arranging them in their forms of life. Is very what Schopenhauer is saying, and I happen to be a very big fan of something like the embodied mind, which is kind of Lakoff talk, which is we get our metaphors, and people have recognized that since ancient times. We get our metaphors. Remember, Hume says, well, we think about guys who rule things with beards, so that may be how we think about God, and not saying God is or isn't, Hume says, and I say that, yeah, we get things from everyday life. As I have to do the creepy Hannibal Lecter routine, do we start with something No, we start with what we see every day, Clarice, which is and his evil anti-Aristotle routine. So, with all of that, this is very Schopenhauer. We start with what we are, what we do, and abstraction and ideas are very much the world and our minds popping off as Kantian glasses off of this real thing in itself, the will and the world and what we actually experience, and then also have these window-like abstractions that kind of float there in weird Kantian ways. Notice this is kind of turning Kant on his head because Kant really loves the glasses and kind of likes the frame of the mind and thinks it's beautiful and God-made, whereas Schopenhauer very much thinks the mind and its ideas and its glasses are very human-fashioned, and that really that blinds us and categorizes our minds into not feeling the will in opera, which is much more the will of the universe, the poodle, and of anything for Schopenhauer like God, that human ideas get between us. It's very, Paul says we see God through a glass darkly. For Schopenhauer, the will of the world is very much there, but he would very much see himself as, I believe he calls himself an atheist because he thinks the world is alive pantheistically like Spinoza, and he thinks that our ideas about it, like a guy with a beard, that's abstract window dressing that's just clouding up the will. Notice, of course, this is far more romantic, Schleiermacher-like, anti-Hegel, very much. So for Schopenhauer, the id and the self is actually an idea we impose on the will to carve ourselves off from the world and each other. The self is a concept. This is very pre-Freud. Your ego is a kind of concept that's wrestling with your id, which is the will. Your true self, and here I'm ham-handedly ramming this into Freud here, but it does make a bit of sense, and also people do debate what Freud actually means in each period of his thinking. But what you see here is very much kind of Kant is like, we are the glasses, and then what's all this mess of stuff? Well, I don't know what red is in and of itself, but you draw a square around red. Okay, that's red now here. And then if I have glasses, then I have objective knowledge of what is truly square and mathematical, as opposed to, say, a shade of red, which may be a random cultural practice. You can't answer that completely. What Schopenhauer is very much saying here, like Freud, is that we feel all these mixed up will and drives and other things. This is very pre-Darwin Freud thinking, which is why this is increasingly then what's popular more than Hegel, actually, very much in German and then French continental thought, is that our id, our feelings, our base emotions are really what our self is, but we have such trouble negotiating that as Kantian kind of glass-grinding, Spinoza lens-grinding Kantian chimpanzees, we human stupid are making our glasses, and that actually is limiting and lowly compared to the deep Buddhistic feeling of the will. So that's Kant, because it is will versus the glasses. thing in itself just as we experience it raw versus how we snap and categorize it in the glasses, it's still keeping those things Kantian apart and hating on Hegel while it does it. But you can see how this actually flips away from the idealism and categories of Kant and even Newtonian mechanics of Hegel, and gets away from mechanics and categories and tries to go away from the square towards something hippie, romantic, and fluid, and more primordial than even ideas themselves, which we impose artificially on the world. Now, all of that is decently in Kant, but he talks about our ideas like they are God-given math. He can't say math is the ideas of God himself. That would be impious. So Kant leaves that part out, and he says, our ideas are the most godlike part of us, morality and math. Schopenhauer flips it Buddhist. He talks like Kant, but then he also says, but it's the romantic will part of us that's really me. And in the moments I'm listening to fine opera, I lose my conception of my idea of myself. I have complex thoughts about this I will not entirely share here. But whether or not you're on Las Drogas, children, in the Berkeley town, I wouldn't never hear myself. If you're listening to opera cranked up loud, and you have a moment of ego death in which you forget about yourself and melt completely into the music, completely sober-minded, of course. Maybe you haven't had a snack yet. In such shamanic practices in this town, you would be having a moment of cracking into what you truly are, which is the will of the cosmos, and your mind failing to draw a boundary around it is what Schopenhauer says. Guess how popular all this is with artists like Heck compared to Kant and Hegel. Artist intellectual types like Kant and Hegel, this stuff is that deep down we crack through our lenses and feel the things that we truly are, which are the passions and will, which is our true id self, as opposed to the superegos forcing the ego as an idea, as a conception, as a concept, as a false form on what is truly and always the seething pile of weasels, which is the id. This is very much how then Freud is accused of stealing ideas of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. He's like, no, it was like that when I got here. And to be in Freud's corner, these ideas were all over the place. Freud happens to be a major thinker after them. Nietzsche's ideas resemble Hegel's a lot. I've increasingly noticed that. But Nietzsche's legitimately not called a Hegelian because actually those ideas are what Hegel pours into everything, and then a bunch of people react to and from that. So technically I would not call Nietzsche a Hegelian, but his stuff is very Hegelian in spite of himself, because it would be. So here again, though Schopenhauer is a Kantian, he calls himself a Kantian, he thinks he's a Kantian, he's a weird upside-down Kantian. Speaking of cats, trying to get into categories, historically. I figure he won't destroy so much stuff. Again, I've left them around the musical equipment before. He actually, here we go. He might, yep. He's going to go in there. Of course, I do like that the music equipment doesn't get so much dust, but of course, if we're going to put fur in there anyway, why not a cat, you know? And yes, I put the latch on there for a reason, because they love that thing. So yes. Anywho's, it's when they're both in there together, opposite directions. It's adorable. I have pictures. Of course, he wants to be in the lower part now. We're not going to be so allowing. He can have the higher parts. And the higher moves, he's just going to take whatever he wants, of course, and the lower things of life. So, speaking of Maslow, Hegel, Freud, and of all of our most bestial of passions, again, technology, back scratcher. You scratch my back, I say technology. So, as with all of this stuff, the self is a kind of abstraction, and it's an idea. And the world is a battleground for Schopenhauer. And I am going to stretch this actually into 2 Schopenhauer talks, which I thought I very might well could. He is continuing to excavate. That it's actually for Schopenhauer, oddly enough, you could say with Darwin, what is the reason my cat gets into everything and makes everything a problem? Well, it's desire and will. Consarn it. Buddy boy. Yes. We have a beast. Once again, he is a rational animal, perhaps. Yes. Anywho's it's. How you doing, buddy? It is appropriate, I thought, especially given Schopenhauer, and we will save it for another talk, but Schopenhauer possibly did die next to a pet cat. So, and he does say, I can see the will of the cosmos in the eyes of my pet poodle. We can see the will of the cosmos thus, if we can see it anywhere, in the eyes of mine, and thus my cat. Although, do I own this cat, or is it self-directed? Again, is he, she, it, let's not assume, self-directed, and thus animate. So, all that aside, yes, cats, and categories, and Kant. What Schopenhauer actually says, and this is a good place to actually kind of pause this and stop, and again, it's the 45-minute mark, is what Schopenhauer actually says is ideas are the problem, will is fine. Think about, for instance, and this is very good thought to sort of stop on because this is very central for the divide in the watershed of analytic and continental thought. And this is going to pick up actually next here with me being uncouth. Forgive me. Is science raising humanity up, or is it just window dressing and humanity is still exactly the same passionate animal it has been? Now, I happen to be increasingly, and have been, a fan of the latter, as in the former and the latter, if you get me. Like, that continuously, humanity has been very much humanity. I am further and further into this kind of view where if we really listen to Amazonians on YouTube, and I do suggest that, and I mean with the subtitles, if you don't speak the dialects, you can see that people are very much people. Now, that's good and bad. That's not good. That's not bad. I come from hippie land. Hippies have sometimes idealized that and said, the native noble savage. No, just people. Not good or bad. People, as you know them, good and bad, right? If that's true, then the history is very much the history of a village is the history of an empire. Schopenhauer is like, science is not raising us up. Actually, if we deeply experience opera, that's what humanity truly is. Notice art is really philosophy, not science so much, with the rationalism and the idealism. Most Germans that you have, well, most German until these other Germans, and then it is more Germans after that who are more romantic, as mentioned. Are ideas good or bad, and do they blind us from or express truly the will and our emotions, and what's the truer part of who we are? These are good questions to ask right here, because we are very much reaching a turning point where you can keep more into objectivity and science and math and try to keep more analytic and say, I believe in rational neo-Kantian principles. Or you can go kind of more post-Freudian, which I very much am myself, trying to cover all sides, but doing that very Poe and Wittgenstein style right now. Misspeaking always, as my cats continuously scratch at multiple surfaces. Now my cat is scratching again. Where is he? Where is he? There he is. And now he's trying to get out of the window I certainly can't let him get out of. Yes, buddy. How you doing? Again, I am surrounded by the will of several cats, most uncategorical. I am going to make several puns about Kant, now and in the future. But, because thought is categorical and uncategorical, yes, and that it's rational, boxed up, but it's also emotive and full of will, and psychology is kind of the one word we can say. Whenever we are like, how are ideas and emotions all mixed up together and what the hexes, the word of the day, and in the late 1800s for the Germans is psychology is the easiest way of describing all this, right? And then saying yeesh and going about your business, and out the door. So, are ideas good or bad? Is science good or bad, or is it just more human? I happen to be very partial to that view, I admit very fully. And does that mean, what are we doing with this and where are we going with it post-war and then in the increasing industrializing world? Well, that would be existentialism, very cynical, leading on to happily and sadly in the postmodern times of everything's kind of all around the place. And that is very much the German romantic pessimism of Schopenhauer onward, who is very inspiring to artists and philosophers and many fine people of many fine places all over the world. As Barbara Kruger says, quoting, I believe Wollstonecraft in the feminist work of art, your body, ladies, is a battleground. So yes, our human emotions, which are displayed more in men than in women than men with the poker face, stoic manliness, I swear. I say, yeah, we're all a seething pile of weasels, and no matter how much of a poker stoic face. Yeah, my paging Dr. Freud. How much of a poker face you or she or he all have together. So, given you and the Mongolian snow leopard and everyone giving forms of verbal consent, again, we are each a seething pile of strange weasels, and the world is somewhat a battleground of our bodies and minds, and our ideas helping or just adding fuel to the fire and the seething pile of weasels. These and other questions you will hear about, and not the final word of, I'm sure, next time, when we will continue on here with Schopenhauer, how science isn't really raising humanity up, and as the Republican guy wrote in response and parody of Hillary Clinton's book, it takes a village to raise an idiot, namely the self, and how our own self and our idea of the self is a very Freudian ego false conception, what Schopenhauer calls the not of the world. And then you can listen to opera and hopefully dissolve it. Again, if it was a problem, I'll solve it. That being said, I will say no more until I immediately continue in part 2 here. So, much happiness, much love, much will, and may we each be a happy, seething pile of weasels, perhaps. And I will see you and your weasels, I raise you a weasel, if I ever see you. Hopefully not with that final line.